Hey heroes, and welcome to this new world video. In the August update, they highlighted the Greatsword and confirmed it will be released in the October update. With the skill tree now available on New World database, I want to take a deep look at all the passives and skills, and then I've put together a version 1 of my DPS and tanking build. So we'll start in the Onslaught tree. First of all, Path of Onslaught. After using any ability in the Onslaught tree, enter Onslaught stance for 10 seconds. This gives you 15% increased damage, and you take 15% more damage. You also gain Quick Charge, which makes your heavy attacks charge twice as fast, but consume 10 stamina each. So the first passive we have is Giant Slayer. This increases base attack damage by 20% when attacking foes above 90% health. It's a nice damage boost, but since it only affects enemies over 90% health, it's quite limiting. I don't really take this if I didn't have another option. The next passive is Heavy Blade. Charged heavy attacks have 15% armor penetration. It's a really nice damage increase and will help take down some of those more armored enemies. We then have Swift Onslaught. You gain 20% haste for 5 seconds after using any Onslaught tree ability. This will be better in PvP than PvE for sure. We then have Keen Posture. After gaining Onslaught stance, your next attack within 5 seconds has a 100% increased critical hit chance. I think this is an amazing ability, and it's going to make Vicious even better on this weapon, allowing you to deal that extra critical hit damage. We then have Aggressive Shift. You can enter the Onslaught stance by hitting with a charged heavy attack. It does say that this occurs even if the attack is blocked, but it will not renew Onslaught stance if it's already active. And in my build later on, I've found a way to work a way around that. We then have Critical Comeback. When you land a critical hit, you regain 5 stamina and 5 base health per second for 5 seconds. I think it's a nice ability, and that stamina regen is going to help with the heavy attacks consuming stamina now. And for the health regen, it should be noted that this is off your base health, not your health after Constitution. We then have Crush the Weak. Critical hit chances increased by 10% when attacking foes with an active debuff. This is a really nice crit increase in passive, and there's lots of ways with this weapon to apply a debuff. We've got Step and Strike. After you dodge, you gain 10% in power for the next 3 hits within 10 seconds, and also the attacks that are empowered by the effect restore 10 stamina on hit. Again, this provides another way to keep that stamina high, allowing you to do more heavy attacks with this build, and we'll get onto that later. And then the ultimate for the Onslaught tree is Unrelenting Onslaught. It says hitting foes reduces Greatsword cooldowns, light attacks by 2%, and charged heavy attacks by 10%. And the cooldown reduction only occurs once per attack. This is basically a built-in refreshing move on this weapon, which is actually insane. So if we take a look at the skills on the Onslaught tree, we have Crosscut. This attack slashes 3 times in a quick sequence, dealing more damage with each attack. You've got 110%, 130, and then 160. The first add-on for Crosscut is Unstoppable Cuts. You gain Grit while performing Crosscut, and if you're in Defiance stance when you activate this ability, then you gain Stun Immunity. And the final add-on on this ability is Cross Execution. The base damage of the final strike is increased by 100% if the target is below 50% health. If you are in Onslaught stance, then the threshold is increased to 75% instead. It should be noted that this says base damage, so it doesn't include your stats or any perks of armors and weapons. Next we have Relentless Rush. This is a spinning attack that applies 20% slow for 4 seconds on hit. The attack hits twice, with the first attack doing 110% weapon damage, and on the second hit you do 120% weapon damage. The first add-on for this is Relentless Power. You gain 10% in power for 10 seconds. The next add-on is Adaptive Rush. In Onslaught stance, this ability applies root to targets it hits for 1 second. If you are in Defiance stance, this ability heals for 15% of its damage, on a maximum of 5 hits. For me, the first part of this is going to be better in PvP for that root, and the second part of this is going to be really nice in PvE. Final add-on is Relentless Refresh. This reduces the ability's cooldown by 50% when you kill a foe. And the last skill on the Onslaught side is a Skyward Slash. This is the weakest of the 3 skills on this tree, but has a lot of debuff value. With this attack, you swing upwards, staggering your target for 80% weapon damage, and you apply 2 stacks of Rend for 10 seconds. If you're already in the Onslaught stance, you'll apply an additional Rend, and that'll meet the maximum 3 stacks. The first add-on for this skill is Skyfall's Sword. You add a follow-up attack that deals 140% weapon damage by activating the skill again or using a light attack. The final add-on for this skill is Sickening Slash. The first attack applies Disease, which reduces the healing by 20% for 10 seconds on your target. It also makes the follow-up attack strike all foes within a 3 meter radius, increasing its area of effect. This final add-on is going to be really nice in PvP. It's also going to be good in mutators where enemies have vampiric or any kind of healing ability. So let's move on to the Defiance Tree. So on the Defiance Tree, we have the Path of Defiance. After using any ability in the Defiance Tree, enter the Defiance stance for 10 seconds. In this mode, you take 15% less damage, you deal 15% less damage, but you also block incoming attacks while charging heavy attacks. The final section there is going to be key in my tanking build, but we'll get to that later on. First passive here is Cleansing Chain. Hitting with the final attack of the Greatsword Chain reduces the duration of debuffs on you by 10%. It is a nice ability, although for my tanking build I'll use another skill which will outclass this in my opinion. Could be good on the DPS build though to reduce those debuffs without having to take a tanking ability. The next passive we have here is Perfect Vigilance. If you are hit while at full health, reduce the damage taken by 20% and then gain 20% fortify for 3 seconds. Although this seems like a good passive, we'll have to see how it plays out in reality. A lot of the time in PvP or PvE, it's unlikely you're going to be at full health when you need this to actually proc. But if you prefer a more automatic tanking build, then this may be a good ability for you. Then we've got Wary Posture. After gaining Defiance Stance, the next damage taken within 5 seconds is reduced by 25%. We have Blade Honing. Base damage is increased by 3% for each Greatsword buff on you, maximum of 4 buffs. For this ability, there's going to be some testing required because it does only affect your base damage, so it doesn't count after your stat distribution or armor perks or weapon perks. And also it says only off Greatsword buffs. So we'll need to check whether abilities like Empower, which obviously can be gained on other weapons, count as a Greatsword buff, or whether it's more specific ones. Next we have Unflinching Blade. Charged heavy attacks have grit and inflict bleeding for 6 seconds, dealing 5% weapon damage every second, and that's for 5 stacks. This is going to be a really nice damage increase, as you'll see later in my DPS build. And we have Guarded Shift. This is a way to switch stance between Onslaught and Defiance, and that's done by blocking for 2 seconds. As with the aggressive shift from earlier, it won't renew Defiance stance if it is already active. Then we have Arrow Deflection. This enables blocking of ranged attacks with a Greatsword, but increases your stamina damage from blocking any attack by 10%. For this one really, you just need to make a decision whether blocking ranged attacks is important to you. If you decide to go with this one, you're going to take extra stamina damage, which is going to make it difficult to tank overall. And in my opinion, if you're playing with a good group in PvE especially, the DPS should be able to take care of any ranged enemies for you. Next we have Faultless Defender. This reduces stamina damage by 50% when blocking attacks, just after raising your guard or with guard point. It inflicts a 5% rend for 10 seconds against melee attackers with a maximum of 3 stacks. For me, this is going to be a key component in my tanking build. It mentions guard point there, which is part of the Defiance stance. Which you can see here is when you block incoming attacks while you're charging your heavy attacks. This means that you'll be able to do a more aggressive tanking build while still blocking, whilst reducing the stamina that you lose. Finally, the ultimate in the Defiance Tree is Undying Defiance. You heal for 5% of the damage from attacks. Attacking within 3 seconds of blocking heals for 15% of the damage dealt instead. As you're going to see later in my tanking build, this is going to allow for a lot of extra healing, paired up with the Faultless Defender passive and also the Guard Point passive. We'll now run through the Defiance skills and then we'll get onto the builds. So the first skill on this side is Calamity Counter. You block for 2 seconds while reducing the stamina damage by 90%, and then you're going to do a counter attack which strikes all foes within 4 meters. The effect this has depends on how many blocks you do. With no blocks, you'll just do 100% weapon damage. With 2 blocks, you'll stagger slightly longer, and then with 3 blocks, you'll do a knockback. The ability also has grit, and you can activate it earlier by using light attack. First add-on here is Jagged Counter. Counter attacks inflict bleeding for 6 seconds for each power level. Each stack deals 5% weapon damage every second, to a maximum of 5 stacks. It's important to note here that the time doesn't stack, so it will only ever last 6 seconds. The next add-on, Critical Calamity. If you are in the Onslaught stance when you activate this ability, the counter attack gains an additional 25% crit hit chance. This means that this ability alone will give you an increase of 50% critical hit chance. This paired with Crush the Weak, which increases critical hit chance by 10% against a target with an active debuff, gives you 60% crit chance without even having keen awareness on your jewelry or keen on your weapon. If you activate this ability while in Defiance stance, the counter attack heals for 20% of its damage for a maximum of 5 hits. This part of the add-on is going to make it insane for tanking as well. The next skill we have is Roaring Rupture. You stab the ground and send out a shockwave with a 4 meter radius that deals 120% weapon damage. You also gain 8% fortify for 5 seconds for each full hit, and that stacks up to 3 times, so 24% in total. This ability is also taunt gem compatible. If you place a carnelian into your greatsword, anyone hit by this ability is going to be taunted for 8 seconds. The first add-on for this ability is Purifying Roar. You cleanse 2 debuffs after using Roaring Rupture. This is the add-on I referred to earlier, being a direct improvement to Cleansing Chain, as this only decreases them by 10%, where this just removes 2 debuffs altogether. The next add-on is Adaptive Rupture. In Defiance stance, the Shockwave pushes foes outward by 3 meters, and in the Onslaught stance, the Shockwave pulls foes 3 meters towards you. This again I expect to be another key component into my tanking build, focusing more on the pull rather than the push. Finally, we have Intimidating Roar. The Shockwave applies a 10% weaken for 10 seconds on hit. Additionally, after a successful hit, become uninterruptible for 5 seconds. And the final skill on the Defiance Tree is Steadfast Strike. Stab the greatsword forward to impale your foes, and then pull back to rip the blade out. You restore 20 stamina on each hit. The first hit deals 70% weapon damage and staggers, and the second hit does 120% weapon damage and pulls the target 1.5 meters. This ability also generates threat. First add-on we have is Steadfast Recovery. The first strike of Steadfast Strike hits, you are healed for 50% weapon damage. If you are in the Defiance stance, the first strike also inflicts 2 stacks of bleeding for 6 seconds, which deals 5% weapon damage every second. This is a nice healing skill, and also that damage over time with the bleed could also be nice. The final add-on we have here is Steadfast Refresh. The second strike of Steadfast Strike hits, reduce the cooldowns of all the greatsword abilities by 20%. It's quite a nice add-on, although it should be noted if you've got Unrelenting Onslaught, that probably becomes irrelevant. So now we've had a look at all the skills and passives, let's take a look at some builds. So the first build we've got here is our DPS build. The skills we have are Crosscut, Relentless Rush, and the Calamity Counter. Crosscut basically because I think it's going to be the bread and butter of the greatsword with the highest damage. And with this third add-on here, while you're in the Onslaught stance, the threshold is increased to 75%, which means that third hit is going to do 260% weapon damage 3/4 of the time. Second ability I took was Relentless Rush, but this could also be swapped for Skyward Slash depending on the content and what you require. Skyward Slash would have more debuffs with the Rend and the Disease, where Relentless Rush will have more damage, especially with the Empower, and it's also got the option for rooting and that extra heal. If you play this skill at the right time, you'll have it off cooldown a lot more often. The third skill we took was Calamity Counter, and this is sheerly because if you activate it from the Onslaught stance, you gain 50% increased critical chance, and as I mentioned earlier, paired with Crush the Weak, that's 60%. And basically, since this is our only skill on the Defiance Tree, this is the only one bringing us into Defiance, and then we can quickly come back with any heavy attack using Aggressive Shift. This means that we're going to be able to reduce how much damage we take as a DPS, but then also do massive damage in an AoE range in front of us. This allows us flexibility with Adaptive Rush. Since we'll be in Defiance stance, Relentless Rush will heal us for 15% of its damage on a maximum of 5 hits. And if we do want to come back to the Onslaught Tree, it's likely going to be this skill that we use, or the heavy attack from Aggressive Shift. We won't want to use the Crosscut from there because we'll take it away from Cross Execution, although if the target's already below 50% health, then that won't necessarily matter. Benefits of this build are going to be really quick heavy attacks, which are basically going to be the same speed as light attacks for any normal weapon, and we've paired up the passives to benefit this. So each of our heavy attacks is going to have 15% armor penetration, and then key posture. Whenever we enter the Onslaught stance, we're going to do 100% critical chance on the next hit. This is going to be easily controlled with Aggressive Shift, because Aggressive Shift allows you to switch back to Onslaught whenever you heavy attack. This means that we'll do a counter attack, we'll follow it up with the Aggressive Shift, and then the next attack that we do has a 100% critical hit chance. These combos are going to equal up to a lot of DPS very quickly. You just need to be aware of the skills that you're using and the timing. Critical comeback is also going to pair well with keen posture, with that guaranteed critical hit chance that will proc critical comeback, meaning that you'll start regenerating your stamina and your health for 5 seconds. We've added in Crush the Weak, which is going to increase your critical hit chance by 10% when an enemy has a debuff. This is going to come in the form of Relentless Rush with the slows. Calamity Counter also does a bleed on that jagged counter, and having those really quick heavy attacks means that your crits are going to hit heavier and harder. And then we have Step and Strike. What you want to do with this is dodge to gain 10% empower for the next 3 hits. You'll do these as heavy attacks, and because these attacks are empowered, you'll restore 10 stamina on hit, meaning that these attacks will basically cost you nothing, allowing you to heavy attack for longer. When you pair all this with Unrelenting Onslaught, it means that your Greatsword cooldowns are going to be off constantly, because you're going to be doing really fast heavy attacks, which reduces your cooldowns by 10%. Finally, just the icing on the cake, 2 perks from the Defiance Tree. We have Blade Honing, which is going to increase your damage even further for any buffs that you've got on you from the Greatsword, and Unflinching Blade. Charged heavy attacks have grit and inflict bleeding for 6 seconds, dealing 5% weapon damage every second. Hopefully you can see why this build is going to get out lots of fast, heavy attacks. It's going to have insane critical hit damage, and it's going to excel at staggering large enemies with stagger bars. Now we'll take a look at my tanking build. I've titled this one, New World is now a solo game. Who needs a healer? Who needs any other DPS? So the passive ability for the Defiance Tree means you take less damage, but you deal less damage. The key component here is Guard Point. Block incoming attacks while charging heavy attacks. Pair this up with Faultless Defender, reducing the stamina damage you take by 50% while using Guard Point. You also inflict 5% rend for 10 seconds against melee attackers, and that stacks up to 3 times. So you have a potential of a 15% rend just for attacking enemies and them attacking you back. Then you pair that up with Undying Defiance. The second part of this says that attacking within 3 seconds of blocking heals for 15% of the damage dealt instead. What this means is you're going to be able to play a really offensive tank. Sure, your damage is reduced, but you're going to be able to do constant heavy attacks while blocking any incoming damage and healing at the same time. The skills we've taken are Calamity Counter. This is going to be for our large group control since the stamina damage is reduced by 90% while you do it. Also, while you're in the Defiance stance, the counter attack is going to heal you for 20% of its damage on a maximum of 5 enemies hit. This is going to be really good for sustain, and I'll explain how you get into that later. The second ability we've taken is Roaring Rupture. This is the one where you stab it into the ground and send out a shockwave. You also gain Fortify, which is going to make you really tanky. And this is our threat generating ability with the Taunt Gem compatible. The Adaptive Rupture add-on makes this ability really great for this build. If you're activating it while in Defiance stance, you're going to be able to push enemies back to make some space if you need it. But my favourite thing about this is actually when you do it from the Onslaught stance. The shockwave pulls enemies 3 meters towards you, and this is going to make for great grouping as a tank. Especially then when you pair it up with a 10% weaken for all enemies hit. The third skill we took was Relentless Rush. This was to allow us to switch to the Onslaught tree, but then we have the Adaptive Rush. While we come from Defiance stance, Relentless Rush heals us for 15%. It's going to be really great when you're tanking, you want to keep that health up. Also, if you manage to kill an enemy with this, you'll reduce the cooldown by 50%, allowing you to keep comboing these stance swaps. This is how I see my standard skill rotation going for this build. We'll first activate Relentless Rush. This is going to slow all our enemies and put us into Onslaught mode. We'll follow that up with Roaring Rupture. Because of the Adaptive Rupture add-on, we'll then pull all the enemies towards us, hopefully while they're still being slowed. Then with all that aggro pulled, we'll activate Calamity Counter. We'll block for 2 seconds with all the enemies attacking us, and then we'll do the counter attack. This is going to apply a bleed to all the enemies hit, and then with Critical Calamity, because we activated it from Defiance stance, we're going to heal 20% of the damage dealt for a maximum of 5 hits. The beauty about this build though is the flexibility. We have 2 skills that are going to heal us, Calamity Counter and Relentless Rush. And if we want to play more defensive, we can switch this around. For example, we can play Calamity Counter first into Roaring Rupture. This is going to allow us to do a big counter attack first with Calamity, and then if we want to push enemies back to create some space, we can do so. Also, we don't have to start with Onslaught. We could start with the Roaring Rupture. This is going to grab aggro for us. And then because we're in Defiance stance, if we activate Relentless Rush, we're going to heal when we do our spinning attack. And then because we're in Onslaught, we can go back into Calamity Counter, and if you need that extra damage to pull it through for your team and play a more offensive role, you can do that with the Critical Calamity, meaning that you're going to get that 50% crit chance, plus that extra 10% from Crush the Weak. This provides a lot of flexibility and a lot of healing. Let me just quickly run over the passives that we have as well. With the Heavy Blade, that's just basically going to be some extra damage from armor penetration. We have Critical Comeback, which is even more healing and more stamina regeneration when you land a crit. Crush the Weak I've been banging on about. That's just going to be crit hit chance when anything is debuffed, and it's likely to be active most of the time. You've then got that Step and Strike. Whenever you dodge, you gain the Empower, but then the next 3 attacks are going to restore your stamina on hit. This paired with Guard Point, being able to heavy attack and block at the same time, is going to create a loop which will make you sustain longer than most fights. In version 1 of this build, I'm going to test Perfect Vigilance, because the 20% Fortify is nice, and the extra 20% on that first hit is also going to be good. We then have Wary Posture. After gaining the Defiance stance, the next hit within 5 seconds is going to be reduced by 25%. It's going to be nice because we're going to be switching between Onslaught and Defiance with those skill setups that I mentioned. And I mentioned Faultless Defender earlier. Basically, if you do a perfect parry, or while you're doing your guard point attacks, you're going to inflict a rend and you're going to take less stamina damage. Also, just a note that if you feel like you've got enough healing in this build, it is possible that you could take some points out of the right hand side tree and instead make it so that you get the Unrelenting Onslaught. This is going to allow you to combo your skills more often due to the cooldown reduction. I'd like to thank you for watching, and I'm looking forward to trying this build out myself, and I'd love to hear your feedback. What worked, what didn't, please let me know. As with all builds, this is just a version 1. We'll continue to develop this as we move forward and tweak it to get the most out of our build. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and I'll catch you next time.